So, Chris Kilmurray on the podcast. Super excited about this one. So, Chris, we've chatted a couple of times, but I would describe our sort of best communication style is commenting on each other's data or comparison videos on Instagram. I feel like that's really how we communicate.
Yeah, and the occasional kind of like share and comment on something. You basically do my work for me sometimes. So there'll be whatever, any of the non-World Cup races, whether it's Crankworks or a Hardline or whatever else, you guys will share a comparison. I'll be like, oh, well, did my work for me this week.
Yeah.
So, because I often, when it's not other World Cups, I'll often do some analysis remotely on footage and data from a race, whether it's a Crankworks, whether it's some national or French national, whatever it is, or a hardline, wherever we got high profile riders, just to keep the old analysis fingers sharp, So that's where you'll find me. And then you guys have posted some content recently that kind of, I don't know, not touched a nerve, but you posted some content recently, so I was like, finally someone else understands the world.
Yeah, I think I know the content you're talking about, but yeah, then also too, like we're just, I'm a bit of a technical nerd myself. My background, I came from the speed skating world. It's a very technical sport, and in its nature, and so I'm really like always looking to compare different techniques, line choices, and those sorts of things. And half the reason I even got into SportsSense in the first place. But so I know that you kind of your background like wasn't actually straight out into mountain biking. And I have a photo here that I want to show you. And then I want to get your reaction to this photo. So it's just going to take a sec for me to pull it up, but then I'll show it to you.
Suspense.
All right. What does this photo make you feel?
That is, I'm trying to think who it is off the top of my head. I don't know, but that was basically like my first love as a very young child, was anything related to what was back then 500cc Grand Prix, what's now MotoGP. And I think because my dad always had motorbikes when I was a kid, so that was kind of like the thing I looked up to, the thing I loved. So yeah, anything related to 500cc, and sadly or luckily, I'm old enough to have seen the transition from two-stroke 500cc's GP bikes up to what we have now. And nowadays, I'm getting closer to not watching MotoGP because the aero side and the tech side is kind of almost taking some of the shine off the riding side of things, And I kind of feel I'm getting older, and I was super lucky to live through those amazing era in the early 2000s of both Formula One and MotoGP, when the riding and the tech was raw, and the riding had to be absolutely perfect to manage the raw tech, So that was my first foray. But really, I never rode motorbikes kind of other than, messing about on motocross bikes at a young age at different times. But I never really got into motorbikes, but it was always my first love for sure,
Yeah. Yeah. This is the photos Kevin Schwantz.
Kevin Schwantz, yeah. I mean, I was a big Mick Doohan fan back in the day. Yeah.
And this is 1993, so this is the year that he was a world champion. Yeah. And so yeah, I was pulling this up, but it's cool your kind of perspective there of like the raw power of the machines back in this day and age, where it was like wrangling the bike. It was like bringing it back rather than like, they almost didn't have control over these things.
Yeah, it was just like, the data acquisition was relatively crude, and the engineers would have had some crazy wild ideas and related to like, engine timing and positioning of crankshafts and positioning of engines and everything else. And the rider would just be given it and be like, right, if it doesn't work, you're going to have to make it work for the next 6 races because we ain't got no money,
Yeah.
Which is kind of like how mountain biking, where we're at with mountain biking, potentially, we're kind of making leaps with downhill, especially small leaps in whatever direction. But we're kind of living that era now where the technology is pushing the sport and the riders are pushing the technology, and it's kind of growing exponentially in terms of what's possible and how capable the machines are,
Yeah, and that's kind of a perfect segue into sort of the next thing. So this is, you're a bit of a numbers guy, and so the next thing that I wanted to pull up here for you to take a look at, this equation right here. I'd love for you to walk me through this little equation that you posted the other day.
The equation is it was basically just to annoy people, just to suck you in. It's like, if you'd either get sucked in by the equation, or you'd get completely switched off, and you just, unfollow me on Instagram probably instantly, one or the other, you know what I mean? But it's kind of like, you see social media, it's so much more prevalent now on YouTube and on Instagram, TikTok. people trying to get their name out there, people, showing what they're capable of as coaches and whatever else, or even riders themselves, and probably more often than not riders that transition to coaching that don't have, a more fundamental kind of coaching / science background. And it's this, the real rough and ready concept of like perfect technique. And you need to move this part of your body into this position at this time to achieve this goal. And yes, that can be an avenue to improvement and success. And it definitely is an option on your table as a coach to tell people to move a particular body part into a particular place at a particular time and to do it repetitively so it ingrains somewhat within the motor system. But there's definitely many, many other ways to achieve the same goal. And what you'll probably see across the board with the best riders in the world is they probably didn't have that much of that style of coaching, that really prescriptive, very descriptive, very internally focused. So that whole post was just, I suppose, giving people a little primer. There's so much research out there from different competing camps in motor behavior, motor learning stuff, that you can kind of pull insight and information from anywhere and everywhere. And there's a huge kind of, we're getting there now in terms of how old it is, but the first motor learning studies were done over 100 years ago now, the first real rigorous ones. The questions of what it means to move, how we organize movement, what it means to be a human have been asked for millennia by philosophers, but the actual more hardcore questions of how do we actually organize movement as humans? How does any animal, any biological thing organize movement? How did they interact with their environment and get from A to B and get food and all those things? Are being approached a lot more kind of rigorously now, and there's loads of different branches and avenues of science that want to approach it with different basic questions, different outlooks, and different premises. So you can just get stuck in. And if you don't have the curiosity to get stuck into that stuff, I think as a coach, you're missing a little bit. You can definitely, just through experiential learning, just working as a coach, trial and error with different riders and athletes, trial and error on yourself, and learning especially from others, and definitely learning from the riders themselves, because as a mountain biker, you'll always learn, especially if you're working with good riders. They'll teach you pretty much more than you'll teach them at all times. So that's one way to go about it, and that's definitely a huge part of my progress and change as a coach over the years. But I think having that foundational curiosity to dig into the science, however abstract it may be and however not related to mountain biking it may be, I think you can definitely still apply it. So those sorts of posts where I throw a few dodgy equations and say like, this bike and this body makes this solution. That's the reality. Like, a bike and a body together create a functional solution to solve the problem of getting down the mountain as fast or as safely as possible. So forcing everyone into the same solution kind of puts the old wagon before the horse, or the horse before the wagon, or just probably shoots the horse in the head, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, and taking a look at this equation, and then also all the details that you went into here, and we're going to get into the details talking about it, but really it's like looking at movement patterns overall, and then looking at how the history of how somebody did something affects those movement patterns, plus all the other variables that are coming into it. And that being that not every rider is going to have the exact same outcome with one cue or many cues. But overall, people online, or people giving this, maybe even remote coaching, or they're trying to reduce things down to one simple cue, and then that's your quick fix. Now you're a pro, whatever you're doing.
Yeah, 100%.
But what's really interesting too, though, is looking at the threshold of where exactly, like, what fundamentals do you need to then build the more style movements on top of that platform. And the one sort of example that I have, and this is a personal example, is I used to play baseball, and when I was younger, I was a pitcher. And when I was throwing, I had this kind of like hitch in my technique where I was getting away with it, but it probably wasn't the fundamentals of it. And so basically what that was is, when I was throwing, is I would pull the ball up without bringing it all the way back. So I didn't have like a full wind up, but I was strong enough to be able to get away with it. And so once I actually, eventually I had to like break that down and then build up the actual fundamentals of how to throw a ball in a better way. And then I started making progress there. And so I can assume, though, that you've probably done a lot of thinking about when is it time to like look at something and say, okay, well, this skill is beneficial or this one isn't, and then break that down into a more like, try to build up a better fundamental base of skills, and then, to make long-term progress.
Yeah, it's exceptionally challenging a lot of the time for me because I work with riders that are already, genuinely established. And even, if I start working with someone at 15, 16, 17, like in their first couple of years as a junior in the World Cup, they've already been riding nowadays for like 6, 7, 8, 10, 10 years, maybe some of them a little bit more. So they've already established an ingrained movement that has traveled with them throughout maturation, and some of them probably aren't finished maturing, but they're getting pretty close to it. So a lot of those movements are highly ingrained, and if you've gotten that far to be fast enough to get to World Cups, the chances of something being faulty per se and faulty mechanics is actually relatively slim. And in the process you're going to go through to consciously crack what is a solidified movement solution and then build it back up, as you say, can be quite risky. So you need to be really, really careful at that level, at the extreme kind of elite level, the world class level, about what you're going to focus on, when, how, and why. When it comes to the complete opposite end of the spectrum, you got novices, complete beginners. You can give people the idea of a movement and the gist of a movement, as you'd say, pretty quickly. And that's when you're prescriptive coaching and you're like, okay, well, look, you need to kind of generally stand in this position. You should feel like this. You need to move somewhat like this. And that's when you can really like slide the cueing and the information you provide to someone learning to ride a mountain bike or learning to get better on their mountain bike from very internally focused, very prescriptive and direct to more broad and holistic, and be like, okay, well, it should feel like this. You should feel tall and stable, as opposed to you should lock your elbows into this position. You've got this whole range of ways to help develop what you'd call the fundamentals of the basic positions on mountain biking. What you then see, and what you do get if you dig into the research a bit more, is that where variation and variability in movement lives and where it needs to continue to exist. And that's probably one of the most misunderstood things in movement coaching of any sport. Especially, you just said the baseball example. North America is gnarly for perfect technique in sports like American football, baseball, basketball, those sorts of things. Whereas actually, if you dig into the research and you watch people who are highly established and really effective in their movement, not just efficient because you need to measure energy outputs throughout the system to understand efficiency, but just effectiveness. Do they achieve their outcome goal of scoring points or scoring shots or scoring tries or whatever the sport is? The people who are highly effective, you'll see that the movement is actually quite variable throughout a certain portion. So like you said, during the wind-up phase in baseball, you'll see massive variations even within an individual athlete as to where the elbow, where the shoulder, and where the wrist and the ball are actually traveling through space. And then as you get closer to finishing the wind-up portion, you're going to go for your, what I suppose called touchdown, when your lead foot hits the ground and you're going to release the ball. That's when variability starts to narrow. Because the solution space at that point, when elbow, shoulder, and wrist work together to launch the ball, depending on what you're actually going to do, what direction you're going to spin the ball, where you're going to throw it to the catcher or the batter, that portion of the movement needs to be pretty stable. So that solution space down there is quite narrow. But everything that happens before that, as you zoom back out, can have a huge amount of variability. So the coach needs to decide with the athlete or even on their own what that variability looks like, where it should reside, and how it should work. So in your case, either yourself or a coach was like, nah, if you actually get a bit more space in the wind up here, the ball is going to travel way further. And that's actually a pretty nice example and a simple example, because you can see, okay, if you keep up your old school movement pattern that was relatively narrow, you didn't get the full wind up, you might actually run the risk of more injury, because you're not getting huge external rotation into internal rotation at the shoulder. So you might actually narrow up and get real tight through the shoulder and then start to run shoulder issues, which will eventually lead to elbow issues, and you probably get yourself a Tommy John in no time.
Yeah.
Whereas, so that's really nice. And you can measure ball speed in baseball. You can measure release speed. You can measure loads of simple things. You can go, okay, if we do this and this, we might get better outcomes because the ball's going to travel faster, or you're going to have better control of what the ball does as you release. So you can do spin balls, fly balls. I don't know what the lingo is for baseball. For mountain biking, when you compare that to the baseball example is both discrete and ballistic. So it's a discrete skill that has a clear start and end. And it's ballistic. You just launch the ball off. And the actual movement organization, you don't have, once you've decided to wind up and go for your launch, you don't have a whole pile of control over it anymore. And that's why I suppose the wind up space can be quite important. And managing the variability in that initial part of the movement is super, super important, because once you launch, you don't actually have any more control. So anyone who's gone to like a bowling alley and hasn't gone there for 20 years, they'll realize that, this kind of feels easy, feels good. And then all of a sudden, 5-6 shots in, you'll start throwing the ball in the gutters. You'll get weird spins and stuff, because actually the whole movement is actually really hard to organize because it's ballistic. Whereas for mountain biking, we do some ballistic movements and some discrete movements, but it's just this continuous stream and flow of movement from the top of a track to the bottom of a track in our case. So understanding where a particular skill or movement might start and finish is way more challenging. So to just say like, oh, cornering, that's a skill. Does that mean a single corner? Does that mean compound corners when you have multiple back to back? Is it still a corner if the entry is really particularly rough and the corner is not really a corner but a bench, and you can kind of arc it, but you can also just slap it and bounce off it? So mountain biking's really in the open domain of skills. It's continuous, it's recursive, and it's kind of not as simple and as straightforward as the classic skills that researchers like to research, which is ballistic and discrete, like you just mentioned with the baseball example. So in mountain biking, we're not flying by the seat of our pants, but the research is out there. There's a lot of work to do to apply it.
Well, yeah, there's so many variables, and even if you bring it down to like the simplest two things, the rider and then the bike, you have all the variables on the bike, and then all these different things that you can do with the rider. But then, so what I was hearing when you were talking about this, about the throwing example, is it sounds like in a case like this that you can start with a lot of different starting points, and this is what you're getting at into mountain biking, where a lot of different starting points, they can be very different. Like there's high variability with those starting points, but then you're trying to get to it like a common endpoint.
Yeah, so like just real simple example would be like a real rough section of track before a corner. You can kind of like just let the body run and flow as you bounce over the rough stuff. But as you get closer to the corner, you're definitely going to have to get yourself organized in terms of where your position is in the bike, so you can effectively deal with the forces coming up from through the ground into the bike to actually effectively get the bike to move left or right. So there's like, and we're super lucky in mountain biking in that sense, is that the environment gives us so much opportunity to develop good variability, to hunt out or kind of clean up the bad variability, and to always get highly, like what I call high fidelity or high representative practice. Like you're developing your skills in mountain biking is actually super easy. And this is why I suppose I commented on one of your posts recently, is because there's this push by the we call them the Instagram coaches or the YouTube coaches. There's this push to simplify and clean up mountain bike skills by making them discrete, by making them clean, by making them measurable and look pretty on the internet with cones and everything else. And actually, if you look at other sports, especially team sports, whether that's basketball, American football, whatever else, the big battle is to get representative practice that actually looks like, feels like, and develops the skills of the game. And it's really hard to do that in your team sport environment because you got your teammates during the week who normally you don't compete against. So you're trying to compete against your teammates and come up with these scenarios that are that are the sport. And it's really, really hard to do well to develop skills. Whereas mountain biking is the exact opposite. You can go out, you can say, hey, I'm going to ride my bike, my e-bike, my trail bike, my downhill bike, whatever it is. I'm going to ride these two tracks 3 or 4 times each. And you've just got exposure to the most amazing terrain possible to develop your skills. Now, obviously, if you're very new, very novice, or very bad for whatever reason, then you're really going to have to understand like the level and the difficulty of the track you need to work on to find that kind of optimal challenge point. So you're not overly exerted and you're not undertrained. So you find that like optimal difficulty to really slowly and steadily progress. But we kind of have that, on our doorstep if you're lucky enough to live in a place with lots of mountain biking. But then even nowadays we got pump tracks, skate parks. We got so much variety in terms of the terrain we can go and develop our skills on. Whereas when you talk about team sports, like literally anything from soccer to basketball to American football to rugby to all these sports, actually getting high fidelity representative practice is a big, big challenge and a big battle. When you talk about applying the scientific research to practice, there's some serious battles as to who's right and who's wrong in this stuff. Whereas here, mountain biking, there's almost like a steps backwards being taken. Whereas like, oh, you need to break this skill down, and actually you just need to go out and ride your bike a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, and the other thing too is at the end of the day, it's the clock, right? So there's your sort of simplified outcome at the end of the entire thing, because everyone's trying to go down as fast as they can, and then the clock doesn't really lie. And I guess like an interesting concept that you touched on a little bit there too is like we have these social media like oversimplified cues, and I guess it's much better for someone, even if it was remote, to have like a connection with their coach, the back and forth, and not like, hey, okay, elbows up or heels down or whatever it is, and like, okay, now my technique is fixed.
Yeah, like 100%. I think people will definitely disagree with me. Other coaches will, which is fantastic. That's exactly how you kind of advance things, is to have,
Yeah.
disagreement that is hopefully partially friendly most of the time. But I think, yeah, like the beauty of mountain biking, even if you're working remotely with a coach, is that you should be able to go out there and grab a couple of clips of you actually cornering on a real corner on real terrain with variable dirt, roots, rocks, and whatever else is out there, and send those clips around to whoever's going to look at them and actually dig into what's happening and what's the root cause of good or bad or enjoyable or not enjoyable riding or bike setup or whatever it is. So kind of, there's definitely a time and a place where if you want to simplify the environment through some sort of reductionism, so that's like get yourself onto a gravel road and do some what would be the classic cornering drills. Like there's nothing super wrong with that. What's wrong with it is that when people think the generalizability from a cone drill on a gravel road is going to generalize to all cornering on all tracks, which it doesn't. Because the movement solution is directly related to the problem on the track. It's not, you don't have a compartment of cornering in your brain or in your body that just deals with cornering. Like it's the same movement organization. It's the same thing no matter what the skill is. So it's us, the human, that chops things up into neat categories. We love a bit of categorization, and there's big battles in the movement sciences as to whether our visual system functionally categorizes things by default or whether that's something we've learned to do linguistically as humans. And I'd be in the other camp where it's like, no, we see the world as it is. It's real to us. And categorization is something we apply to it. And it's something, especially in Western societies, as science has progressed so fast from the Industrial Revolution, that we're super keen on categorization, super keen on breaking things down and understanding processes through reductionism and parts and everything else. And that just brings us to this point where everything gets chopped up. And the assumption is that, like, if I work on my manuals down the road, I'll be able to manual any feature on any trail. And that's partially there, but not quite. If you want to learn how to manual, absolutely. Simple grass field. So if you fall on your bum, you ain't going to have a sore bum the next day. Yes, guaranteed. And you can really explore the full extent of your movement, the full extent of the range of motion, and what actually happens when you swing off the handlebars with your arms, or if you actually just use your center of mass and push your bum back and really get that feeling for, pivoting on the rear axle and actually getting a manual going. And really exploring the good and the bad of movement in a simple environment, fantastic. But thinking that that's you done, and you don't need to then apply it to a real trail and figure out how to do it quickly or slowly or stylishly or whatever else. Like that's just craziness, So it's like breaking things down has its place, especially for some riders. And there's this whole process of what we call calibration or recalibration, where you as a human have this internal frame, and the world is at the external frame. So that's the classic idea of the first run blues. If you ride downhill or you ride trail bikes, first couple of corners, first run, whatever, you feel a bit like, oh, this isn't great. I don't feel like me at the moment. You know what I mean? I don't feel like my normal self. And that's that whole process of recalibration. A slightly longer term process if you've taken a big chunk of time off the bike. And it can bring a lot of benefits, especially for the professional riders. But as an amateur, if you've been skiing all winter because you live somewhere in the northern hemisphere that's all sunny and beautiful and amazing and snowy, you go through a process of what we call re-attunement, which takes a bit longer than recalibration. Recalibration can happen in 2 or 3 corners or a run, which is why we probably see some people at the World Cup races do poorly in split one, because they have the real struggle to fully calibrate quickly to what's happening in the environment and how that relates to them. So you go through those processes. So using a breakdown of technique or a breakdown of skill in simple, just playing during your warm up. If you're pedaling up the hill and you want to do just mess about on the fire road, and get a feel for the bike, get a feel for the tires, get a feel for the suspension, or just go and do some basic cornering drills or just some real basic riding on a super simple, fun flow trail, a blue, easy trail, whatever, then that's absolutely cool, and it's the kind of thing that's going to help you learn. But thinking that the more broken down something is, the more prescriptive it is, the more cognitively controlled it is, the more it's going to improve your technique and then apply to skill. Most of the research is definitely in the opposite direction.
So why is reattunement, or why is it a longer break for someone who's a very experienced athlete? Why might that be beneficial to them?
Because they've operated, I suppose, you probably need some of the motor learning research to really get a good explanation, because explaining it like colloquially or explaining it through kind of folk science is actually pretty tough, because you just ask the question, and if you try and explain it through like, they got fresh and they've got more or less dopamine or whatever the buzzwords of physiology are at the moment, it's actually quite challenging. So you probably need to actually lean into some more rigorous motor learning research especially, and the cognitive side of things. So where we have the more classical side of things, where we have motor programs, and we tap into motor programs and they get refined and organized and updated in a computational sense. It can explain it. It probably struggles a bit more. So if we go to the other end of the spectrum in terms of the motor learning research, and we go to what would be called dynamical systems theory, and then you'd have basically movement patterns and movement in general would get organized in what we call an attractor state. So it's this deep, solidified, stable, but adaptable solution to movement that a world-class level mountain biker will show all season long. And I'd say off the top of my head, someone like Troy Brosnan always looks the same. So Troy Brosnan showing you the kinematic, the actual real world visual of just like always looks dialed. And I think staying in that dialed perfectness for 8 months, 9 months, probably like 10 months a year now with off-season testing and training starts to kind of wear you down functionally, physically, mentally, psychologically. The brain and the body is all one big system, and you'll just start to get burned out because you're doing the same thing and you're pushing the limits of adaptability. So your movement needs to be super dialed, super consistent, adaptable, but very stable, because it's really authentic, high quality, highly effective movement. And the longer and more often you do that, the narrower your little space of functioning gets. And then all of a sudden, little tweaks, niggles, injuries creep in on the functional body side of things, but also that feeling of like, fuck, I have to go fast again. You know, like there's loads of like perceptual things where the rider just feel like, wow, I'm just kind of sick of riding well and sick of riding fast. There's loads of things on the body side of things where things start to break down. And then there's actually just the functional organization of movement that probably gets less effective because it's trying its best to do the same thing in similar but adaptable ways. So taking a big break from it means you have to go through that short process of recalibration or reattunement, and everything just works a bit better. And maybe you'll dwell in some other solution that's slightly better than the one from 2025. So maybe your 2026 you is the 2025 you with 5% sparkles and glitter on top.
Yeah, and there are I've definitely seen some examples. Like, I've been a fan of amateur sport all my life, but there are tons of examples of, let's call it, veteran riders or veteran athletes. They get to a point in their career, they say, I need to take a little bit of time. They step back, assuming they keep themselves fully in shape. They're fit. They come back with a new perspective, realizing how much you enjoy what you do, and then being able to like come back, and because you're back into these more playful states, it doesn't feel like a job anymore. It's not as laborious or tedious. That's how I've always interpreted it, but it's really interesting to also hear kind of your perspective on how it's like, with attunement and a very much more scientific explanation than the one.
No, it's honestly like your explanation is really nice, because if you dig into it, like the explanation I just gave you before that was just zooming in on the movement side of things, on how how some of the science and how some of the theoretical aspects of the movement science would explain it. But actually what you've done is zoom back out to the entire cultural, social aspect of an athlete leaving the sport and realizing that, the real world's a bit, and actually I do enjoy this, but I just enjoyed it less because I was been forcing myself to do it for money almost. So actually what you've got there is what we call cross-scale dynamics or multi-scale dynamics. And everything is recursive in that sense. So you leave the sport or take 6 months off and you're like, oh, my body feels a bit better. And I went to the gym loads and I feel really good again. I didn't have to manage the gym load and the riding load. And I've had loads of meals with my friends and family. And I realized that life's great and the birds sing. And actually mountain biking is sick and I love it. I didn't love it as much when I was just doing it all the time, but now I'm out of it. I good. So then you've got all what we call the recursive loops, where the feel-good factor of having dinner with your family more often and going to the bar and having a few Negronis or martinis has an impact on how you feel overall, and that has an impact on how you plan and prepare to ride a bike. And then the fact that you rode your bike just with your friends and not with the team or doing actual training made the whole thing feel even better. And then that goes back to your day-to-day life, and those loops across the scale from culture to social to your daily life, right down to the smallest minutiae of how the muscles make you feel because they're not tired and sore, how your brain releases different chemicals to help with reorganizing movement and connections across different parts of the brain, how that functions across the nervous system, cross scale. So you have this full cross scale dynamic of the big massive pieces, which is culture and history, to the slightly smaller pieces of social life, and then your particular little circle of friends and family. and maybe the sport larger, and then right down to the smaller details of how I described movement through attractor states. Actually, science, classical Western epistemologies of science loves a bit of chopping things up. And the smaller you can chop it up, the more machines you can make to measure it, and the more things you can sell, and the more money you can make. And that's the bottom line.
Yeah.
Dollars are the bottom line, right? But actually, when you go like that, you go, it's actually not a bad idea to chop things up into parts, as long as we have the tools and the perspective to synthesize again and be able to zoom back out to the whole. And that's kind of like comes back to our chat about nothing wrong with a cone drill, as long as you're not telling me that that is cornering. That's not cornering. That's just you making your bike go around a few cones. That is not a cornering technique. That is just the movement that's required to go around those cones. So if you zoom down to just organizing a cornering drill around some cones, that's sweet. I don't care. Especially you get a couple of good mountain bikers and a couple of less good mountain bikers and get the clock on, or get a bit of competitive slalom going. You're going to get like the very extremes of good and bad movement, and you're going to get some of the best learning possible because you got competition.
Yeah.
But
And
don't tell me that that's cornering technique. That's just going around these cones as fast as possible. You know what I mean? So as long as you're able to zoom in and zoom out and keep some sort of clarity on your frameworks and your models, and have the ability to synthesize, not just analyze, and keep a nice worldview of what performance actually is, then big thumbs up.
yeah, and what I've really liked doing in looking at your background and all the things that you've worked on is it's exactly what you said right there, where the cone drill, doing a cone drill for a corner, it is breaking down like what the movement patterns into something simpler, but then it's applying it in a flexible way to all of the ways that you could apply it after that, right? Like it's taking that and then leveling it up into more specific scenarios. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit here, because there was one thing that I got into, a bit of the background of like how you've been using tech. And, we've seen all of your data, and like, you put this on Instagram, and it's fantastic stuff. Really, this is like, I think this is a real engine behind a lot, the entertainment, or the education of downhill. But something that I came across was that you're using AI a little bit to sort of take all of the information or everything that's being said in group chats.
Mhm.
Is this, and then synthesizing that down into like, it turns that into data. And so talk a little bit about how you're using that and how that's been beneficial.
Well, like you need to be able to the bottom line is if you don't control AI, you're going to get Skynet. So I don't know if people are listening and they're old enough to know what Skynet is. Terminator 2, Terminator 1, Terminator 2, Miles Dyson, Skynet, nuclear weapons, game over, humans done. If we don't just show AI who's boss, then we're in for a bad ride. So I just try and use it. It's a wild bit of gear, and I use all the different AI engines possible. Some of them paid, some of them free, and it does some mad stuff with mountain biking. Because it's obviously just a large language model, it just has its training data, which is just millions and billions of little bits of words about mountain biking. So it's always focused on crazy things like risk. It's obsessed with risk. I'm like, actually, risk is something we don't talk about at all, to be totally honest. It's like it's something that just does not really come into it, other than like really specific scenarios. So AI does some weird stuff, but yeah, I'll use it for anything, and basically try it and really work hard on a good prompt to really beat it down, beat it into submission to make it do what I want it to do, and see if it's actually beneficial to the analysis process. So where it is really beneficial is writing code, because that's its bread and butter. It only makes the smallest mistakes, and then I clean up the mistakes in the code, and then I learn how to code essentially by cleaning up the mistakes in AI. So that's been really beneficial. And then just something like okay, we actually had a huge back and forth. So at the races especially, but definitely also at team camps, we'll have individual WhatsApp groups for rider, mechanic, and myself, like a little triad. We might add someone else in there if needed. But usually it's just the three of us, and we can share videos, we can share insights and updates, whatever else, especially at the races. If we are doing some bigger bike setup changes, for example, and the mechanic can say, okay, we changed this, and this on this run. And so you basically just have this log. So you can just use AI just to suck out the log. It's got all the timestamps, it's got all the data. Sometimes it does a terrible job, sometimes it does a great job. So I think, yeah, and then you can just train it up to anything. So summaries from training camps, testing camps. There's so much value to using AI for what it's good at, which is manipulation of symbols, which is language.
Yeah, exactly. And it really comes down to like the quality of the prompt and everything. I'm using AI in a ton of different ways. you're using it now, like you're using SportsSense a little bit, like with comparisons. And could you talk to me a little bit more about how SportsSense has kind of changed your analysis, or how you're using SportsSense in kind of your day to day?
SportsSense basically is just slotted into my analysis life because it's just easy to use and does everything you need it to do, which is like because I went through prior to SportsSense, I was going through every bit of program, and I'm unfortunately for me, I'm an Android nerd, so I don't have as many options.
Yeah,
Much to many people's dismay at the races, I don't have AirDrop to send you sick clips. I'm sorry. I do have PayPal if you want sick clips though. Um, so yeah, SportsSense is just slotted in. It just does everything. And you guys initially during the beta phase were super receptive to all of the potential updates and ideas, which is really helpful for me. So it just slots in. And I think the key thing with the analysis and especially after races, away from the races, when you have a bit more time, analysis is a different thing because you can be way more contemplative and you can ask way more questions and really take the time to work through your answers and what the visual data, so the comparisons on screen, movements, joint angles, all these things, what they might actually tell you. At the races, we're really time pressured. You got 6 hours of practice or less now at a World Cup. So we're really time pressured. So it's kind of the best quick and dirty analysis and data you can get that isn't going to be risky, and it's going to inform either further analysis when we have time, which is in the evenings, post practice, post qualies, or heuristic based best bet decisions for the races. You know what I mean? Like, okay, this line is going to be best bet because of X, Y, and Z. So to actually make the most of an analysis platform like SportsSense, you need to probably have yourself a broader model, like a first principles model of what it means to be fast on a mountain bike, and more specifically how you win a downhill race, essentially. And if you don't have that first principles kind of model of how to win a downhill race or how downhill races get won, then you'd literally be analyzing anything. You know what I mean? Which I think I've been around the World Cups now working since 2013. So it's been a big old stint now, and I think in that time there was basically two of us trackside regularly in 2013, two or three of us. Now it's just like it's the Wild West, like it's a free for all out there. So I'm sure there's plenty of people out there that are using SportsSense or other apps, and they're like just sending clips left, right, and center. And I've heard it from athletes I work with over the years. They're like, "Oh, I mute the group chat during the race because there's just an insane amount of information." So the great thing with SportsSense is that I can just export the clips I want in the way I want them, store them the way I want them, organize them the way I want them, and I can deliver the information as and when I see fit. You know what I mean? And that's supposed the experience and the expertise of a coach. So it's not just a barrage of information for the rider. Some riders can take the information and just love it, lap it up, and they can take that visual information, they can take words, symbols, and they can apply it on track easily. Other riders can't. And you really need to learn your rider and learn what works for who and why. So having something that's just easy to use, whether it's making a feed in the app or whether it's exporting the clips, because that's the best option for me. It needs to be versatile because all the riders use the data at the races in very different ways.
Yeah, and that's really like where we see SportsSense kind of slotting in. Is it's definitely, we need the coach layer with the knowledge. Like, you can't just have a bunch of clips and exactly sending them back and forth. Like, this is made for coaches to take a lot of the admin or make things quicker, or provide tools that might be useful so that you can get your job done a little bit faster. And it's cool to hear that, like, during the World Cup weeks, that you have less time, and so SportsSense becomes a really useful tool for you because you're able to use it fairly quickly. So
Yeah, even just like from my perspective, you need a phone with a big memory and a phone with lots of RAM, and you need the app to play ball for importing and exporting clips. You know what I mean? And it's something as fundamental as that is crucial, because if you've literally got 6 minutes to do your analysis between practice sessions,
yeah,
and you want to get 3 jobs done, 3 little tasks done because the rider wants this information before the next session or whatever else, and that relates to our prior planning and whatever else is working towards winning a race. Like, if the app's not playing ball, it's crashing or it's a bit janky or junky or whatever else, then no bueno. So just the simple things done really, really well is definitely number one.
yeah. And again too, it's this other thing of, it is simplifying data down a little bit. It is a tool at the end of the day, and it is data at the end of the day that you're just presenting, that
Hmm.
allows people to make decisions based off of that data. There is a responsibility on the rider to understand some of this, at least, or in whatever way they want to understand it, or whatever works for them, to then
Yeah,
make the
there's a responsibility on me as the coach. I always feel to kind of bring the rider with me on the analysis journey.
yeah, Exactly.
help educate them, and then they help educate me in terms of what their preferences are. And then like some of them get I work with a few riders who get really good in terms of like you can always spot issues, whether it's a piece of video analysis or a comparison, whether it's actually in the sector data from the official times from the UCI, or whether it's things you see on the internet or clips or whatever else. You can spot anomalies. You're like that sector time doesn't make sense, or it does make sense because of X, Y, and Z. And you need to almost bring the riders with you so you co-analyze, and then you need to build the trust so that they're happy to be like, no, in this scenario, you just do it all. You just tell me what's better, what's faster, what I'm doing good, what I'm doing bad, whatever. Sometimes they just want a piece of blunt, straightforward, like, hey, what am I doing? What am I not doing? What can we do? How do we win the race? And then other times you want this co-created understanding of how and why they might go about building a race run, and how and why their competitors might be better or worse here and there, and how that filters into the overall tactics of the race run, and then how that kind of you zoom back out to the strategy of the whole week and maybe the whole season even.
Yeah. Well, and one of the pieces of data, and this is something that I've been really interested in, and we used to track it when I was an athlete. One of the pieces of data that I've been thinking a lot about lately is like HRVs, and basically like neurological sort of deficits or neurological fatigue. And what is incredibly interesting to me in the downhill world is how good at pro downhill athletes are at sort of resisting that fatigue, or sort of managing the fatigue. There's two parts to this question: are using HRV, and then also what do you see with athletes with like their ability to manage their like nervous system through a race week?
Yeah, it's really interesting one. So I've got a couple of riders who use Whoop, for example, as a way to measure HRV. If you're measuring on your wrist, like a Whoop band or a Garmin watch, or whatever else, you're not measuring heart rate variability. You're measuring pulse rate variability. And depending on the nature of your venous system between your heart and your arm, you could be measuring something slightly different. Now, globally, your trends over a period of time probably track relatively well. But if you're going to measure HRV, and this is what we did in the past, we don't do it as much, anywhere near as much anymore. Back when it came on the scene over a decade ago, we used an app called Isolate, which doesn't exist anymore, which is really, really good because it was super simple and straightforward. Measured at the heart with a real specific protocol to kind of reduce the amount of sympathetic saturation there was in the morning. So a real specific protocol, so we got the best kind of signal possible. We don't do it as much now. And actually, for the downhillers especially, if for the enduro riders, it's a bit different because it's really, really good to help you track your tolerance to endurance training load. And it's really, really good tool as a surrogate for tracking your changing aerobic fitness as well. So for enduro riders, there's definitely some potential huge benefits for tracking HRV regularly. Downhill riders, there's a lot going on. And what we've kind of discovered actually the last few seasons is that how the stress and the fatigue of a race week, and especially back-to-back race weeks, unfolds is broadly similar across every athlete because they do a similar amount of runs and the tracks are similarly demanding. But then there's obviously the nuances of each athlete. And generally what happens is like you're kind of through all the stresses and strains of managing a race week and everything that goes into that one top tier 100% committed run, you basically are operating on the limits of sympathetic and parasympathetic withdrawal all week long. You're just kind of going massive highs as you ride, massive trying to get yourself chilled again in between, and then getting yourself pumped up for qualies and finals. And then you basically just have the classic kind of complete another parasympathetic withdrawal on a Monday morning or a Sunday morning after the race, and everything crashes a bit, And some riders are quite resilient and it just doesn't happen. And if you're really, really aerobically fit, it's one of the big benefits of big aerobic engine of just being globally aerobically fit is that you're less likely to have those post-race crashes. You'll deal with the overall strain and fatigue and stresses of a World Cup week quite well. Whether that big aerobic capacity actually has an impact on your ability to win races is very debatable. Beyond a certain point, you definitely need a base foundational level of aerobic capabilities. But whether more and more actually has a linear, impact on your race performances is highly debatable. But where it definitely does have some big positive impacts is that the cross-scale dynamics, the multi-scale dynamics over multiple days, multiple weeks, a big portion of a season, you'll see, especially for the track HRV, you'd see those that were tracking consistently better probably have better aerobic capabilities and probably deal with the stresses and strains of racing better because of it. Whether you actually win races because of that is definitely not a guarantee. You know what I mean? And that comes back to our whole chat about reductionism. If you reduce the ability to deal with the stress and if you reduce the ability to perform at a World Cup to the ability to deal with the stresses and strains measured via HRV, you've lost sight of cause and effect there, and you're reducing things to a simple, what we call efficient cause, which is a simple snooker ball, billiard ball, do this, get that, bang. And that's not how things work in the real world. But like we already said, knowing what you're measuring and why and where it could have positive impact is fantastic. So yeah, I think it's something, the big issue with HRV for me, sadly at the moment, is that doing it on the wrist is, so I'd love to see some of the data from riders who've been doing it consistently at the World Cups. And I think really all it'll probably do is confirm what you already know, that Monday morning after a race, I'm pretty clapped. And then there's a rebound over a couple of days, and the rebound's better the earlier in the season because you're more aerobically capable. And as aerobic capabilities wane off throughout the season, you've probably reducing your ability to rebound quickly. And if you get soft tissue injuries, big impact, big hematomas, that has a huge impact on your ability to recover from all of the stresses and strains of racing. So super interesting. But I think for me, the potential negatives and the difficulties of measuring on the wrist is tough. So you probably need to go back to measuring on the heart. So maybe even inspire me to guinea pig. It's a challenge to do it really well consistently every morning, you know what I mean? And then even at the race, because you wake up on quali morning or race morning. I wake up on race morning kind of excited, buzzed. Wake up at 5 a.m. sometimes in race morning because it's time to go, you know? So the athletes are the same. And I think that level of what they call sympathetic activation on race morning would just completely drown out the actual signal within the noise of a HRV measurement, you know? Or maybe that is what you're getting. That's the reality, is that you're ready to go, you know, you're pumped up. And if you're not, you probably got a bigger problem.
Yeah, and I guess in HRV too it's very interesting, and I think it's sort of misunderstood more broadly, especially because it's a bit of a hype topic at the moment with people where they're comparing HRVs and they're going like, one's this and yours is this, when it's such
compare your acronyms, HTPs, XTPs, HRVs, compare all your acronyms, please.
Yeah, it's completely individual, and just to like give it a little bit less credit because there's so many factors that can affect an HRV, but then to give it a little bit less credit is when I was doing them, we found that basically being dehydrated could really affect your HRV. And so it's like, oh, you didn't drink enough water yesterday. It's like you wake up in the morning and like your HRV is way off, and it doesn't necessarily indicate that you're stressed or tired or anything. You could just have a few more electrolytes and some water.
You've actually nailed something which is a big part of my broad philosophy as a coach, is that context is the kingdom. Yeah. And when people talk about context, they always talk about contextual factors. Oh, that's a factor. So it has a bit of an effect, but maybe not. It's a bit wishy-washy. The reality is that context is causal. So when people actually want to reduce things and measure things like HRV or whatever else and say, oh, that's the cause. But the reality is it's the context is causal. And it's so hard for people, especially all of us in, the weird countries, the Western educated, kind of independent, free, rich nations of the world, absolutely pummeled into believing your classic Newtonian style of science, that everything has an efficient cause, and because we can measure the position of Pluto and the moon for the next 6,000 years, then of course we can predict human behavior tomorrow. But no, we can't. We can see that with the weather. We can't predict the weather, but I can tell you where the moon's going to be in 6,000 years time, because they're on different scales. And for us at the biological human level, operating in our little social and cultural circles, context is causal, and you've just nailed it on the head. Wake up and realize you forgot your girlfriend or your wife's birthday. Wake up and you realize you forgot your child's birthday. HRV is going to do some weird things. Wake up, having had just one glass of red wine because it was real nice. It's going to affect your HRV. But for some people, maybe less. Some people maybe more. So yeah.
Well, I had this one class in my undergrad, and it was all about it was really about this whole holistic view of human performance. One line that stuck with me was the professor at the time, I can't remember her name, but the professor basically was like, you can train right, you can eat right, you can do all of these things right, but if your girlfriend breaks up with you, I'm telling you're not going to have the best day. It's like,
I've heard of some athletes winning the Olympics because of that. But there you go. You know what I mean? Yeah. But that context is very much causal, and in your professor's example, it was a negative outcome. But in examples I've heard previously, it was definitely a positive outcome. So yeah, crazy. It's totally true. Like, it is totally true, and it sounds people don't like to accept the realities of complexity, you know, and the word complex and complexity more broadly is kind of used as a throwaway remark and a catch-all for that's just hard to deal with. So we just call it complex. But actually, the complexity sciences give us so many really strong, really powerful tools to understand complex biological systems nested and embedded within even more complex, bigger systems, which is a human within a social system within the planet Earth. You know what I mean? So it's like the complexity sciences are probably some of the most impactful ways of posing questions as a coach, posing questions as a scientist, and understanding the world, you know. The case of like, oh, you can have a holistic worldview, and we'll do that once in a while. I think you should, like I said, you should be able to zoom out to that holistic view all the time, you know, and zooming in is fine as long as you have the skills and the ability and the curiosity to zoom back out, you know.
So you touched on context, and really interesting sort of concept of context and how you're using things. If you're in the gym and you're training for strength, how important to you is movement specificity? But let's also assume that, like, if you're in the gym and you're working the right systems, so we're looking in there and going, you know, you want to strengthen your lower body, so you're working your legs in the way that you want to move it. But how important is movement specificity in that context?
Yeah, movement. Yes, it's important, but caveats. Again, it sounds like a cop out, but it's absolutely not. So what you need is that bigger model of what mountain bike performance is, because if you don't have that to lean on, and some of those first principles, you're going to get lost in the gym pretty quickly. So you'll see lots of like highly contextual, highly sport specific training in the gym environment for certain sports. So track and field, sprinting, running, the throws and stuff in track and field. You can go into the gym and you can work on, say, your hip lock, for example, which is that toe off position when you're sprinting. And you can actually do a lightly loaded or moderately loaded movement and really dig into the fundamental key portions of coordination that go into running or sprinting and overload them slightly by adding a bit more load. Okay. And for mountain biking, we're in the luckiest position ever, is that you cannot replicate mountain biking perfectly in the gym because you don't have the bike and you don't have the acceleration due to gravity, because the key source of energy especially for gravity, well, for the gravity disciplines, but now the cross-country guys are tapping into this as well, is potential energy. It's the transfer of potential to kinetic back to potential, which is mechanical energy. Then whoever maximizes the differential, the change in mechanical energy over a run, generally wins or gets close to winning. So whoever keeps the most potential energy in the system and converts it to kinetic at the right time wins the race. Exactly why a Jackson and a Loic can get the same time on the clock, even though they're completely different sizes and shape, because it's just this interplay of moving your energies around. You're moving your potential to your kinetic back to your potential right at the right time. So we can't perfectly replicate all of those demands in the gym, and we don't want to. And it's really, really simple. You cannot get the exact same amplitude and timing of movement in the gym as you get in the bike, because movement's rate dependent, we say. So a movement's rate dependent. It's highly specific. So the exact timing and shape and the muscle fibers that get involved in the connective tissues and the neurological signals that descend and go back up and down, whatever way you want to chop up the movement, is rate dependent. To copy it exactly in the gym is next to impossible. But what happens as a mountain biker is that you're constrained by the bike. You got your hands up front on the handlebars. You do a bit of push and pull, which is kind of bench pressy row. You stand on the pedals and you get yourself into a hinge. And depending on the length of your femurs and the strength of your quads and your hamstrings and your glutes, you will or won't use your knees or your hips a bit more. Depending on the steepness of the terrain, you're going to use your knees and your hips a bit more, because one of the key portions of mountain biking is the control of center of mass over your base of support. So very simply for us, you go to the gym, you improve the capacities of those tissues and those general shapes to produce large amounts of force, or even just the connective tissue themselves, including the muscles, because the muscle functions as a connective tissue in this kind of quasi-isometric state you get when you're kind of semi-squatted on a mountain bike. So you go in there and you can just overload the system. Can you overload effectively on a mountain bike? Yes, if you haven't ridden much, or if you don't ride very often, or if you ride some pretty gnarly stuff, but it's actually really hard. And the better you get at mountain biking, the harder it is to overload the structural portion of the human body. So you go to the gym, you do some deadlifts, you do some squats, you do some lunges, you do some more specific core work, whatever else. And I'd say 9 times out of 10, it transfers really, really well. Now, once you get quite strong and you're riding at a really high level, searching for incremental, and there will be smaller incremental improvements in strength, or searching to improve your strength for the sake of it or to improve your CrossFit Games open score or whatever else, probably isn't going to have an impact on your performance. Now, if you enjoy doing that, that's absolutely fine. And I work with riders get motivated by putting more load on the bar, by going faster, going heavier, jumping higher, whatever. And that's, as a motivational tool, it's absolutely fine. Whether it'll have this continued linear impact on your performance is probably unlikely. But we're super lucky in that the shapes were constrained on track by a bike, means that we can super easily just go into the gym and get stronger.
Yeah,
And then you
and
got the other side. The other flip side for us is the health side of things. So the gym is a great place to develop health, and health and performance are like a complementary duality. They're not a dualism. They don't fight each other. They go with each other. So the gym is a great place to do that, to work on things that don't that get underloaded or consistently overloaded on a bike. So that's a great
yeah,
place for it.
and a really interesting, what I'm hearing there too is it is generally building strength. It is generally building the strength for the movements that you want to be doing. There is also a bit of a give take. And so the example that I remember seeing, and maybe the way I interpreted this video was, do you know Jacob Ingebrigtsen? So he's one of the greatest all time middle distance Norwegian runners. He was in the gym doing a movement that was a squat. That was he had the bars, basically the set, the stoppers set at where the range of motion would only be down to how much his knee would bend while he was running. So he was turning a squat into a movement so specific that he wasn't even using muscles in a way that he wouldn't be using them while he was running. This is how I interpreted it, right? So it's like the give take there is taking away the movements that might not matter, or even the recruitment of the muscles that might not matter for you as a rider or a runner, and just using it in the way that you would use it while running or riding.
Yeah, 100%. Like, so a basic isometric layout, and we use isometrics for rehab and for performance, similar to that, and basically just removes all of the coordination demands and stops you trying to mimic riding in the gym, and you just get strong, and it's just morphological change. You get morphological changes in the muscles and the connective tissue at those joint angles and probably either side of it. Super simple. The risk there is that if you do too much of that and do a load of sport specific practice and training, then injuries might creep in. But it's the simplest thing ever. For, like I said, movement's rate dependent. So on your bike, you deal with really specific bike stuff, and then in the gym, just do something super simple and basic like that, isometric. Easiest thing ever.
Yeah, but then also too, you like another example I'll use is like you sometimes see riders or people kind of get this, like they might not have the healthiest perfect posture and like, a day to day somebody walking around, but they've trained in such a specific way that their bodies have adapted to like, the sport that they have to do. And that's like maybe not a long-term health thing, but that is more of like it's adapting to that specific thing to get the best outcome. So just like really interesting to see how people kind of have that give take and how they manage. What are you most excited for this upcoming season?
I'm excited, really excited this season for two things. That's the women's racing in both elite and junior categories, to see the depth of ability, the depth of support that's never ever been around in women's racing, really. We've also had standout female athletes like Rachel, like Miriam, like Sabrina Jania, like Tanya, whatever else, but we never had this depth of talent. And in the men's racing, the juniors transitioning, because that's like that really interesting talent development story of like, okay, these juniors are super fast as juniors. Will they actually make it stick as elites? So they're the two things. I think it's super simple. And the men's racing, we need more men in finals because there's too many fast ones now. So it's going to be a super interesting season. I don't know. Every season feels a bit watershed in some regards, but this one's going to be, in terms of for the elite men's category, it's going to be the pretty watershed in terms of the depth of talent. 20 guys maybe that can get a top 5, you know what I mean? And then the women's racing is just insane. The new crop of juniors coming through, there's more coming through, first year juniors again, that are going to be able to post times that are consistently at least top 10 women, elite women, but if not top 5. So yeah, crazy.
Yeah, and I think in listening to you talk on a Downtime podcast a little bit, like, definitely I would encourage people to go check that one out, because you talk a lot about last season and how excited you are for this upcoming season. And sort of one of the overlooked categories was, or like not overlooked, but it wasn't as obvious on social media and that sort of thing, was the junior women's category, and now all the women we have coming up. Such a competitive field. It's going to be super exciting. Chris, we really nerded out on this podcast. This was this was definitely an awesome time. I really appreciate all of your insight and your feedback, and love just hearing you go into the complexities of how you think about coaching and movement patterns and movement analysis. This was a fun one.
Yeah, man, thank you. Any time. I'm sure some people would have got annoyed with a bit of philosophizing, but if anyone wants to philosophize further or get nerdy further, they can always hit me up on Instagram or wherever else. Probably Instagram's probably easiest if they want to chat. I'm always open to chat if anyone wants to do some nerding. You'd be surprised. I get a good few nerdy comments from different people with different skill sets, which is always really fun, you know.
Yeah, and that's the fun in it. All right. Well, Chris, thanks a lot, man. Cheers.
Yeah, you too, buddy. Thank you.